Hey everyone, sometimes you come across a book that was written decades ago but feels like it could have been written this morning. Today we're diving into one of those. It's from 1941 and it asks this incredibly relevant question. Why do people, when they finally get freedom, so often seem desperate to run right back into a cage? Let's unpack Erich Fromm's classic, Escape from Freedom.
Right off the bat, Fromm hits us with this huge paradox. We're taught that freedom is the ultimate goal, right? It's what we fight for, what we build societies around. So why does history show us, again and again, that people seem so willing to just give it away? How can one person's liberation be another person's absolute worst nightmare?
To even begin to solve this puzzle, Fromm tells us we've got to understand something fundamental. The whole process of becoming an individual, not just for each of us personally, but for humanity as a whole, is a real double-edged sword. And he has a specific name for this process: individuation.
So what does he mean by that? Well, Fromm gives us this really powerful analogy. Think about a child and its mother. As that child grows and becomes more independent, it also loses some of that incredible security and sense of belonging it had at the start. Fromm calls those initial connections primary ties, and breaking away from them, well, that's our very first taste of freedom.
And this brings us to a super important distinction that Fromm makes. He says, hang on, we're not just talking about one kind of freedom here. There are two. On one hand, you have freedom from. This is the freedom we usually think of, breaking the chains, right? Freedom from oppressive traditions, from a tyrant, from some authority telling you what to do. But then there's the other side of the coin, freedom to. And this is the positive side. It's about what you do with your liberty. It's the freedom to create, to love, to actually become your own unique self.
Okay, so here is the absolute heart of the problem. What happens when our freedom from explodes, but we haven't yet figured out our freedom to? You've broken all the old chains that used to give you a sense of security, but you haven't yet built new, meaningful connections through things like love and productive work. And that's when this huge, scary psychological gap just opens up right under your feet.
And the result of being stranded in that gap? It's terrifying. This newfound freedom stops feeling like a gift and starts feeling like a curse. It leaves you feeling isolated, anxious, and totally powerless in a world that suddenly seems overwhelming and maybe even meaningless. And that, Fromm argues, is when freedom itself becomes an unbearable burden.
Now this might sound a little abstract, but Fromm says, nope, let's look at a real-world example. He points to a massive turning point in history, the Reformation, as the perfect case study. This, he argues, is the moment our modern anxiety was truly born.
Just think about the difference. In the medieval world, you weren't free, not in our sense of the word, but you were never alone. Your place in the world was fixed. It gave you this incredible sense of security and belonging. Then, the modern world starts to emerge and just shatters that old structure. All of a sudden, you're on your own. You're an individual, up against endless competition, feeling isolated and full of anxiety.
This quote from Fromm just nails it. You went from having a defined role, a peasant, an artisan, a knight, to just being an individual, a single person in a world run by these new, impersonal forces, like the market and capital, who had to sink or swim entirely on their own.
And for the average person, especially that growing middle class, this new world was absolutely terrifying. They were being crushed by economic uncertainty, filled with deep spiritual doubt. They felt like a tiny, powerless speck in a vast, indifferent universe. All the old certainties were gone, and this new thing called freedom felt an awful lot like abandonment.
So you have this huge psychological crisis spreading across society. And who steps into that void? Religious reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin. And they offered a new kind of salvation, not just for the next life, but from the unbearable anxiety of this one. I mean, listen to this quote from John Calvin. It captures this new doctrine perfectly. The message was radical. The problem they preached wasn't the world. The problem was you, your individual will, your personal pride, your desires. That was the enemy. The only path to salvation wasn't to assert your freedom, but to completely annihilate it. And this gave people a clear path back to feeling safe. First, you had to accept that you were totally powerless. Second, you had to destroy your own pride. Third, you had to submit completely to the overwhelming power of God. And the payoff for this total surrender? You got a new kind of certainty. You finally had a way to escape the crushing weight of your own self. Fromm says this whole process gives birth to a very specific personality type, the authoritarian character. This person feels deeply powerless, so they have this desperate need to be part of a higher power, to feel safe. They admire authority and crave submitting to it. But here's the twist. At the same time, they need to dominate anyone they see as weaker to feel strong themselves. Fromm saw this perfectly in Luther, who would bow to the princes but would viciously condemn the rebelling peasants, calling them the rabble.
Okay, so a big history lesson on the 16th century. Why does any of this matter to us right now? Well, because Fromm wasn't just writing about history. He was showing us a timeless psychological pattern, one that is playing out right now inside all of us. Fromm even brings in a quote from the philosopher John Dewey to really drive this home. The battlefield isn't out there somewhere in the past. It's right here, inside of us. This temptation to run away from freedom isn't a historical artifact. The struggle between wanting freedom and craving security, between our individuality and our urge to submit, is happening inside each of us every single day.
I mean, just think about our own lives, that relentless pressure to compete, the paralysis that comes from having endless choices for everything, that feeling of just being a small cog in a giant machine. Fromm would argue these are just the modern echoes of that same unbearable freedom from centuries ago. And we see the escape routes everywhere, the urge to just conform, to adopt your group's opinions without question, or to lose yourself in consumerism, letting brands and algorithms tell you who you are.
And so Fromm leaves us with this final, really powerful question. What are we actually doing with our freedom? Are we using it to become our fullest, most authentic selves, or are we, in all sorts of subtle ways, just looking for our own escape? Is our freedom a gift that we're embracing, or is it a burden we're secretly trying to set down?